Hello and welcome to the Quietly Visible podcast. This is the podcast for introverted women who want to thrive as leaders and in life. And I'm your host, Carol Stewart, founder of Abounding Solutions and author of Quietly Visible, Leading with Influence and Impact as an Introverted Woman. So if you're an introverted woman and you want to thrive, this is the podcast for you. If you are not introverted, but you want to better understand your introverted colleagues or friends and family, or you want to be authentic and be your authentic self, then do listening because this is for you as well. And if you've not subscribed to the podcast, do hit the subscribe button and share it with someone else as well. Now, I'm really looking forward to today's conversation because the person that I am speaking to, her name is Karla Packham-Corteil, and she's done some research on introversion, and I'm really looking forward to hearing her tell us about her findings in her research because it's a topic that I'm very interested in. As you know, I've also done my research, and her research looked at how she examined how perceived introvert mistreatment, such as being ignored, overlooked, or dismissed, influences leadership aspirations, appetite for progression, and well-being. So hello, Karla, and welcome.
Hi, Carol. Thank you so much for having me.
It's great to have you here. So before we start to look at your research, just give us an introduction as to who Karla is.
Okay, well, I suppose first and foremost, I'm an introvert. So that's an aspect that's fundamental to my identity and something I'm very proud of these days. I'm incredibly curious. I really like to find out what makes people tick and understand people's motivations and experiences. And I'm a bit of a nerd when it comes to that kind of thing. I really like to research and study. So I suppose from a professional perspective, my background is in facilities management. So I've been in that world for 20 or so years in various different leadership roles. Started very, very early. Um, I was 18 when I had my first leadership role. And that was a point for me where I was really probably at the point in my life where I had the biggest challenge of navigating my introversion. And I'd somehow to this day, I don't really know how I found myself in that role of heading up a department at the age of 18. But it was something that I really enjoyed doing. And it was only an acting role. And my plan was to go off and be a forensic scientist. And I was doing a degree in biomedical sciences. And I finished that degree. I did go off and do that. And then I came out and went straight back into facilities management, worked my way up. And, I found there were a lot of similarities between the world of FM and what it was to me to be an introvert. So
Mhm.
there's a lot of behind the scenes work that happens in facilities management. And I think that enabled me to progress quite quickly. And I was, quite young to be managing quite large contracts. And I'd developed as this leader. And just before I left the world of FM, I was managing kind of national contracts, big teams of people and other managers, and heading up flagship contracts for the organizations I worked for. And then I found myself kind of in a position where my favorite thing to do was develop people. So I transitioned my role in 2024 to go into a kind of leadership development as my main focus. And so that's where I am now. But running alongside that, I guess, is my academic journey. And that started because I was that accidental manager and I found myself, I wanted to do the best I can. So I threw myself into self-development. I was reading all the books I could find, all the podcasts I could find, the TED Talks, all of that kind of thing, and decided that what I really wanted was essentially like a formalized, structured qualification to evidence my leadership ability. So I actually started with HR. I went and did an HR qualification, but that was 11 years ago. So where I am now is there's been an 11-year academic journey from that point to now where I'm on my second master's degree. So I've just started with the University of Northumbria doing occupational and organizational psychology.
Oh wow, very interesting journey. And your journey sort of mirrors mine to some extent. I had my first leadership position. I was a little bit older than you. I was 22 when I had my first leadership position, and I was somewhat of a accidental leader as well. Yeah. So before we explore your research, what has your journey been like as a woman who is introverted?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a really relevant question because that really underpins everything for me
Hmm.
anyway. And as I said, like I when I was 18, I was basically having this internal battle with the idea of being an introvert. And I think, I've listened to a lot of your podcasts and read a lot and heard a lot of stories from other introverts, and my experience kind of parallels, I think, a lot of those conversations in that growing up, I was labeled as quiet. And at the time, I didn't have any issues with being labeled as quiet. And, you know, I, there wasn't any kind of like stumbling with that. But if you look at my school reports, and my parents very diligently kept all of my school reports. So I've got everything charting from primary school to right the way up to college. And I did a bit of, I suppose, just my own internal reflection work, looking at those comments, and throughout it, you see Karla is very quiet. Karla is a very shy child. And then things like Karla's very bright, but her shyness holds her back. And there was this narrative that went the whole way through my childhood, and I got to um I think my GCSE years, and I had some feedback in a parents' evening from one of my teachers that saying that I wouldn't do very well in my English exams because I didn't talk enough. And um, I did actually, I did quite well. I was very proud of myself of navigating that and came out with an A
Good
star.
for you.
But yeah, I think by that point I'd sort of internalized this message that being
Mm,
quiet was a problem. And that ran so deep in me that it became almost social anxiety, really. And I found myself almost withdrawing into my quietness, and away from things. And it wasn't really until much later that things started to change. But that narrative kind of went into my leadership world as well. So I came out of college, went off and did my university thing, and came out and went back into these leadership roles. And then I started hearing, oh, you're too quiet really to be a leader, right? It's going to stop you progressing because you're so quiet. And it was very frustrating for me because the evidence didn't stack up. I was getting promoted, I was getting, I was doing well in my role, but I was quiet, and that didn't seem to be a problem in actually delivering my job role. It was just a problem that other people were seeing, really. And again, this is where the kind of academic side of things comes back in. And I was doing a diploma, and part of what I had to do was complete the Myers-Briggs test. And I
mm,
did that, and I got typed as an INFJ. And I was reading that profile and thinking, like, this is mind blowing. I'm reading all of these things about me that I recognize in myself, but they're framed in such a positive way. My quietness, it wasn't me being shy, it was me being reflective or considered. And it made much more sense to me. And that sort of started this journey of accepting my introversion. And
mm.
I went and read Susan Cain's book, and that was like page after page of seeing my own experiences laid out in front of me. And I think that gave me the confidence to embrace my introversion and stick to my guns and be that introverted leader. Um, and from the perspective of being female, I think there were a few things that I had to navigate. I was in a large part of my career, I was in the world of security as well. So that's quite a male focused role.
Mm.
So I am 5'2", very, very quiet. And, female, and navigating all of these difficult scenarios. And I think having that confidence in who I was and that identity was able to help me navigate some of those challenges and, you know, succeed in those roles.
Mm. Yeah, and I think once, and that was the case for me, once I got to understand what introversion was and see the strengths of it, that changed things for me, because I too had bought into the narrative that, all the misconceptions about introversion, and oh, you're too quiet, you need to speak up more, and as you say, that can then leave you thinking that the issue is me, or the issue is you, when there's nothing wrong with being quiet, and quiet doesn't necessarily mean shy, because extroverted people can be shy. And that's something that really bugs me, where children are marked down or made to feel that they're not good enough because they are introverted, because the impact that that has as they grow leads to self-doubt, imposter syndrome, and all those things. And unless they are have the awareness, or like your experience or my experience, they can go through life thinking that they're not good enough.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I'm sure, my teachers, when they were writing those comments and telling me those things, were doing it from a place of wanting me to succeed. But,
Hmm.
it's kind of not really something that is consciously thought about, the impact of that. And I guess that all kind of leads into this idea of the fact that we do have this preference for extroversion, and we do have that extroverted ideal,
Hmm. Yeah.
that gets talked about.
Yeah, yeah. And I remember a few years ago going into my primary school, my old primary school, and doing a talk to the children about managing their emotions. And after speaking to the head teacher about this sort of introversion, introverted children, and just talking about the challenges that introverted children have when they're told that they need to speak up more and what have you. And then I got a lovely email from him after, saying how, I'd really made him stop and think how much they're doing their introverted children a disservice, and how, they're made to feel that confidence is sort of measured on how vocal they are and how much they put their hands up in class. And so, I mean, I haven't spoken to him since. I'm hoping that that reflection did bring about changes in the school. Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome.
And so, what led you to decide to do this MSc psychology and to do your research?
Yeah, sure. So I've been on this journey. I did back-to-back qualifications. It's studying is kind of my hobby, so I do it in
Hmm.
my own time for fun. And I've been described as relatively relentless in my pursuit of qualifications. But that's, largely just because I really like studying. And
Hmm.
I'd got to, I think it was the summer of 2022, and I was nearing the end of a level 7 qualification in coaching and kind of considering what I was going to do next, what my next steps would be. And in all honesty, I hadn't for a second considered a master's degree. Um, I don't know why, it just hadn't really, kind of been something that had come into my mind. And I was actually listening to your podcast. So
Hmm.
it was the conversation with Latrice Oram around her PhD work on that method to my quietness. And that was a bit of a penny drop moment for me of I could study this in an academic world. And in a relatively uncharacteristic moment for me, I enrolled on a master's degree, and 3 months later I was studying. So it was quite a quick decision, and one that
Hmm.
I absolutely am so glad that I did. Um, and so yeah, I knew from my very first days on the qualification that I would be wanting to look into introversion for my thesis. It was a part-time course, so it was 2.5 years, and
Hmm.
my thesis module wasn't until April 2024. So I had a long time to go and explore the literature, and I fell very deep into a research rabbit hole at that point. Every moment that I had that I wasn't working on my, the modules that I was doing at the time, I was deep in the research around
Hmm.
introversion, and I think I was very, I was fascinated, but what I was experiencing was this frequent narrative around kind of introversion being positioned in quite a negative light,
Hmm.
and we briefly touched on that earlier, but this idea that even if you think about how we measure introversion, it's measured typically as low extroversion. And so if we're measuring extroversion and we're associating extroversion with things like sociability or with, gregariousness and being outgoing, that kind of indirectly leads you to believe that introverts are the opposite of those things, and they're antisocial, and they're, that's where the shy part comes in and things like that. And I found that strange that it was kind of so heavily biased in that direction, especially the leadership research. And I was kind of like looking at the different kind of core bits of like the seminal works that were out there, and seeing the fact that extroversion is so consistently linked to leadership success. And then I came across like the work of people like Adam Grant, where they had started to change the way that introversion was being viewed, and linking parts of introverted personalities and traits with successful leadership. And so I guess I became interested in what exactly is it that either allows introverts to go into leadership roles, or what prevents them from getting there. And what impact does this negative framing of introversion have in that relationship, essentially?
Right, okay. And so tell us about the what your research question was, and your findings, what you found.
Yeah, so as you mentioned in the introduction, I looked at this concept of perceived introvert mistreatment, and that was something that I'd found in some studies by Dr. Mallory McCord from Old Dominion University in Virginia. And she had developed a scale to measure this concept of perceived introvert mistreatment. And what that's essentially looking at is how individuals are perceiving the treatment they get, whether it's directly related to their introversion. So what we're seeing is introverts were experiencing mistreatment, and they had associated it with their introversion. And so that kind of became the foundational idea of my research question. But I was also interested in kind of how can we navigate that? What kind of things were involved? And so I looked at the concept of leadership self-efficacy as well, so that the self-belief in our own leadership abilities. And I explored how those two things related to one another in relation to leadership aspirations, and how likely somebody was to want to go on and progress in their leadership roles. So I carried out a quantitative study. So it was a lot of statistics, and quite complicated research that took me down some really interesting routes. And so I had a survey that went out to my participants, and my sample was built up of self-identifying introverts that had either aspirations to go into leadership or to progress in their leadership roles. And I suppose probably it's important to say at this stage that this was part of my thesis requirements. My work isn't published, it's not peer reviewed. This is just kind of my insights as a reflective practitioner, and my student perspective of understanding what my findings were. And one of the things that came out of my research is that it didn't really go the way that I had originally anticipated. So all of my research that I'd done around the concepts before I put together my hypotheses was focused on the idea that if you were experiencing mistreatment, it would have a negative impact on your well-being and on your leadership aspirations. And my data did show that there was a direct impact on well-being, but not on leadership aspirations. And that was surprising for me. It wasn't necessarily in line with kind of some of the existing research that was out there. And whilst perceived introvert mistreatment, I think at the time that I was researching, hadn't really been looked at any point other than what was done in that development of the scale. There's a lot of work around perceived discrimination that kind of influenced my ideas. So it didn't make a lot of sense to me at that point. And I started to kind of explore the data in a bit more detail. And 40% of my participants had reported having experienced perceived mistreatment associated with their introversion in the 6 months prior to completing the survey. So that's quite a high level of those experiences. And that was having an impact on their well-being. So I had a bit more of a look into the leadership self-efficacy side, and what I found was that perceived introvert mistreatment was related to leadership self-efficacy, in that what was happening is the more my participants were experiencing that mistreatment, the lower their self-belief was in their leadership skills. And it was that then influenced whether or not they would go on to, then follow their leadership aspirations. So that was kind of one big takeaway from my research. And the other part, I think, is the part that really fascinated me, was that my sample of self-identified introverts came out when I asked them to complete a measure of extraversion, predominantly were extroverted.
Okay.
Which was surprising. So I used a measure that broke down extroversion into 3 different facets. So sociability, assertiveness, and energy. And it was only sociability that was on the introverted side of the scale. And I found that really interesting. So obviously, my conclusions were that for the most part, my participants associated their introversion with their sociability. But assertiveness is recognized as a leadership skill or trait. And I looked at kind of the demographics of my sample as well, and 65% of the respondents to my survey were they were already in leadership positions and were aspiring to more senior roles. So I kind of wondered if maybe they had developed this assertiveness as part of their leadership journey, and that was then buffering the impact of this mistreatment. So I think kind of really my 2 core takeaways were that, potentially how we frame assertiveness isn't quite right somehow. We've associated it with it being an extroverted trait, but a large part of my introverted or self-identifying introverted participants had high levels of assertiveness. I thought that was really interesting. And then obviously the impact of perceived introvert mistreatment on self-belief, I think, was very, very interesting.
Yeah, very interesting results. And so, as if we sort of unpick some of this, and something that I see, because I've coached a lot of introverted leaders, particularly introverted women, and they're probably in their sort of mid to late careers, and I find that the more mature they are in the career, the more they've come to know themselves, the more they've come to know about themselves, and have an understanding of who they are. But at the same time, that self-belief, imposter syndrome, I don't like the term syndrome, but imposter experience is quite big because of this perceived introvert mistreatment, or because of environments that favour extraversion as well. And it's often the case that they've gone through their careers thinking that because they are introverted, that there is something wrong with them.
Yeah, I think it does raise a lot of questions kind of around how, I mean, I suppose from that early education perspective, like you mentioned at that point, but as well as organizations, I think there is a lot of room for discussion around bringing personality into the DEI agenda, and including, and not just introversion, but all of the different aspects of different personality types, recognizing that the importance of being able to be authentically yourself, and what happens when you are hearing this narrative about something not being good enough, or that a part of your personality is a problem in whatever it is you're aspiring to achieve. And I think it's important to start to address that. And obviously it is being discussed. I know that there are organizations out there that are actively seeking to explore more around what introversion means for people in the workforce. But I think when I reflect back on my own career, and I was in a position where I was able to be quite authentic, but it was that point at which I felt fully confident to just be my whole self, that I think my own assertiveness started to build, and I was able to kind of become more of an advocate for other introverts rather than just navigate my own challenges.
Yeah, and I do find through my work and with myself, when we feel comfortable and confident to be our authentic selves, we are naturally more confident, more assertive. And, so that is something that I advocate, is that, introverted leaders don't try and change their personality or act or perform extraversion, that they be themselves, but they find ways to modify their behavior depending what situation they're in, the outcome they want, just like how extroverted people should modify their behavior at times, in different situations. It works both ways. And in terms of what you're saying about organizations becoming more aware of it, I do think they are, but I also think there are still a lot that are not. I think Susan Cain published her book in 2012, and before that there was it Marty Lane who'd published her book? Was it The Introvert Advantage? Was that hers? And it's like 14 years since Susan Cain's book, but there's still issues and challenges about this, and people who are experiencing that perceived introvert mistreatment.
Yeah, yeah, and I think, like you say, there is definitely work being done. But I'm still experiencing it. I still find people mentioning it, whilst it doesn't have the same impact on me anymore. But it's still something where you'll hear people say things like, "Oh, I grew out of my introversion," suggesting that it's something that you do need to grow out of. Which I find quite strange. But I will say that all of the work that I do with the people in my role now in the leadership development, I'm having those conversations where I'm hearing people that are more, they've potentially been in their career longer than I have, or have been in more senior roles than I have, and they're still experiencing these same things. So it's clearly still a problem, and the more we talk about it, I think the more that we advocate for ourselves as introverts, the better it will get. But it's still a big journey to go.
Yes, it is. There is still a long way to go, but at least, we are going somewhere. But like you said, just continuing to raise awareness is important. And so, where do you want to go with your research, or have you even thought about where you want to go with your research, or what you want to do with it?
Yeah, so that's frequently on my mind. And I've spent
Hmm.
like the last 13 months since I submitted my work and finished my degree, thinking about what's next. And I knew I had already lined up the fact that I would be going on to do the masters in occupational and organizational psychology. So the one that I did before was essentially my conversion
Hmm.
degree. And I knew I wanted to focus on that organizational landscape. So I will be due to do more research.
Hmm.
I guess that will be April 2027 before I get to that point. And I'm in exactly the same boat. I'm exploring the literature constantly. I came across
Hmm.
some really interesting research, which kind of aligns with the psychological safety um, kind of theories and things that was looking at. I have to get this right because it's not easy for me to say, but psychological authenticity climate.
Oh.
So it's research that was published in 2022. And it's looking at kind of, I suppose, making the jump from psychological safety as the wider concept to specifically looking at the individual level about,
Hmm.
the climate that enables us to be our true selves, our whole selves in the workplace. And I'm really inspired by that.
Hmm.
I think for me, because like I mentioned, I'm very curious, and there are lots of different avenues that have kind of come out of my original research. And so yeah, looking at what's coming next, it will definitely be in the world of introversion.
Hmm.
But yeah, I'm not entirely sure yet if I'm going to go down looking at kind of more of that quantitative side of research and exploring the relationship between assertiveness and introversion a bit more, or if I might go more into the psychological safety side of things, and
Hmm.
how can we support those leaders in those early stages as emerging leaders to develop that leadership self-efficacy, that assertiveness to support their
Yeah.
ability to be authentically introverted and successful leaders.
Yeah, very interesting. And I think I'm going to go and look for that research that you mentioned about the psychological authenticity climate. I'm currently writing a book which is based on research that I did recently as part of an MSc psychology, looking at how introverted women leaders experience belonging and psychological safety in the workplace. Um, and so my book is going to be based on that, but I'm thinking of making my book not just based on introversion, but belonging and psychological safety as a whole in terms of how people can thrive in the workplace. So that research will probably be very interesting to look at as well.
Yeah,
Mm.
I've only recently discovered it, so it's kind of just as part of my current kind of day-to-day
Hmm.
uh, kind of delving into the literature. And the second I found it, I was like, oh, this is an interesting piece of work here. And I think that world of psychological safety and that belonging, especially kind of in the current climate that we've got, is so incredibly important.
It
Um,
really is.
and
Yeah.
obviously I have the introverted, I suppose, bias myself in the fact that that's the area I'm interested in, but just kind of
Hmm.
like broadly looking at how we're able to show up at work and get the best out of ourselves, and also for
Yeah.
organizations really to get the benefit of the more authentic we are in the workplace, the better the engagement, the job satisfaction, the lower the turnover. There are wider organizational benefits as well.
Well, this is it, and that's why I fail to understand how, so many organizations don't see that. I know there's been a big pushback to DEI because of what's happening in the US, and we're seeing the ripple effects of some of that over here. Although it's good to see some organizations are still sort of continuing with their endeavors. Um, but it whilst I don't think DEI should be an add-on because it should be integrated into everything, but I do think that that it is a bit concerning how certain things are, it's like going backwards rather than forwards in what we're seeing.
Yeah, it's alarming, and I think I write a Substack, kind of exploring some of my lived experience and combining it with my academic knowledge and insights and things like that. And I was exploring some of those concepts about kind of those changes that have happened, and
Hmm.
um the impact that it can have on us, and particularly people that are very values led as well. And
Hmm.
I have quite like a deep-seated justice sensitivity, I suppose is the technical term. And kind of witnessing that bias, whatever format it takes, whether it's introversion or something else, I find it really difficult to get my head around. And
Hmm.
having the experience, like kind of not only as an introvert, but as somebody when I was originally, in my leadership career, younger, and also female, kind of all of those things that I was performing. So I didn't understand why there was a challenge there. And I
Hmm.
just think it's a really interesting area.
Yeah, yeah. So, well, thank you for this. So, where can people find you on Substack? Is it your name? Um,
It's under, so the Substack is called Between People and Place. And
hmm.
um, I'll give you the link. It's relatively new, but you should be able to find me under my name as well. But
Yeah.
you can find me on LinkedIn, and there's a link to my blog on there.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so what we can do is put the link in the show notes so people can go and read your thoughts and so forth.
Brilliant.
Your
Yeah, it's
reflections.
it's
Yeah, so
predominantly reflections and strange ramblings, but it's a
mhm.
lot of introversion. Everything I view is through that introverted lens.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you, Carla. It's been a lovely conversation. Yes, your research sounds very interesting. So thank you for sharing it with us. And yes, I will share your Substack link in the show notes so people can go and read your reflections and your ramblings. So
My
thank you.
ramblings. Yeah. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you everyone for listening, and do go check out Carla's Substack page and Yes, follow her, subscribe to it and hear what she has to say when she updates it. And if you are looking to increase your confidence, influence and impact, if you haven't completed the free assessment on my website, go to abouncedingsolutions.com. Under the free resources, there's an assessment that you can complete that will give you ideas about areas that you can focus on. And so until the next time, bye.